Hey everybody, it's Randy Ray here again with another June on the Range video from the Literate Texan here at Driftwood Ranch. And this time I've got a list of my top 10 favorite Western authors, or my top 10 favorite Western writers, which I suspect is going to be a very different list from most of my pals who are also engaged in June on the Range with me, because I'm not as big a fan of Westerns, at least in terms of literary Westerns, as a lot of my compatriots. But I am a fan of Westerns. I'm just a fan of neo-Westerns and contemporary Westerns a little bit more than your traditional type Westerns. And so I haven't read as many of the older Westerns that are so popular. I mean, Louis Lamour makes my list, but Zane Grey doesn't make my list. Zane Grey doesn't do anything for me. I think Zane Grey's very hard to read. But anyway, without further ado, this is my top 10 list, and you can tell me where I got it wrong, because I'm sure you're going to feel like I got some of it wrong. But you can also tell me where I got it right and what surprises there were on here, okay? So the number one on my list of favorite Western authors, which I was surprised I didn't see, you know, when I don't see a whole lot of videos about my top 10 Western authors or my top 10 Western novelists to begin with, but I'm surprised that I don't see Larry McMurtry listed on more of them. It's almost as if people think that Larry McMurtry only wrote Lonesome Dove, and yeah, it might have been the greatest Western novel ever written, but it's still just one Western novel. But the truth is, Larry McMurtry was incredibly prolific. I mean, you know, maybe not Stephen King prolific, but pretty doggone close. And Larry McMurtry wrote basically, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but for the most part, he wrote mostly traditional Westerns and historical novels, and he wrote contemporary Westerns and neo-Westerns. And a contemporary Western or a neo-Western is just a Western that takes some of the tropes or some of the archetypes of the old-timey Westerns, which were usually set between 1865 and 1890, and transplants them to the modern day somehow. So, for example, The Last Picture Show, or Horsemen Pass By, or Dwayne's Depressed, or even Terms of Endearment to an extent. That one's pushing it. But those are neo-Westerns, contemporary Westerns. Whereas Lonesome Dove or Streets of Laredo, or one of my favorite Larry McMurtry novels, is a standalone novel called Anything for Billy, which is about Billy the Kid, and it's wonderful. If you haven't read it, you should. But yeah, Larry McMurtry is my number one, and these aren't in any particular order. But I mean, if I had to pick one to be my number one, I couldn't pick anybody but Larry McMurtry. Also went to the same college that Larry McMurtry went to. I went to the University of North Texas. Larry McMurtry maintained a bookshop out in Archer City, which is his hometown, which is only about 2 hours west of here. And I've always been kind of sad and disappointed that I never made it out there to see his bookstore. My understanding is that if you wanted to go in there and talk about his novels, he didn't have anything to say to you. But if you wanted to talk to him about the book selling business or being a book dealer, you know, he could find plenty to talk about, especially if you knew what you were talking about. But yeah, those days I missed my chance there. So, but that's number one on my list. Number two on my list is probably going to be a surprise to a lot of people, is Robert B. Parker. Robert B. Parker is better known for writing crime novels in the Spencer series, but he started a series of Western novels. I think they're the Virgil Cole and Somebody Hitch novels, and they're really, really terrific. The first novel in the series is called Appaloosa. It was made into a film. There were eventually 10 novels in the series, but Parker only wrote the first 2 or 3. Those are the best ones. I think it was Appaloosa, followed by Brimstone. I don't remember the names of the other 7 or 8 novels. I got through the first 4 or 5. I'd like to finish the rest of them. But of course, you know, he's one of those writers who had a big enough name that they put his name in big letters on the cover of books that he didn't write. They're just part of that intellectual property that he created while he was still alive. Nonetheless, I did read a couple of the ones that his successors had written, and they weren't bad. But his style, this kind of hard-boiled, terse, laconic writing style, suits itself well for the Western novel. And I really enjoyed the characters. So yeah, Robert S. Parker is number 2 on my list. Number 3 on my list is Joe Lansdale. And I don't know how popular Joe Lansdale is outside of Texas. He lives in East Texas. I believe he lives near Nacogdoches. But a lot of his stuff is weird Western combined with neo-Western kind of stuff. And I encountered Joe Lansdale originally through a book of his called Bubba Hotep, which was also made into a movie. The premise behind Bubba Hotep, and it's not much of a Western, but there are some Western elements in it. But the premise behind Bubba Hotep is that Elvis didn't really die. He's actually still alive, but not in the way that people think. It turns out that Elvis had swapped identities with an Elvis impersonator so that he could get away from the lifestyle that he'd been living. You know, he could get clean and straighten himself out a little bit. And this Elvis impersonator could go out on tour and be rich and stuff. But then the Elvis impersonator had a heart attack while he was still pretending to be Elvis. So Elvis never got to get his original identity back. And now he's in a nursing home with, you know, some crazy old people, one of whom thinks he's the Lone Ranger, one of whom thinks he's John F. Kennedy, though he clearly isn't John F. Kennedy because he's black. And they wind up fighting this Egyptian mummy who happens to crash in a train nearby. And I've probably spoiled a lot of it already, but it's a great book. But a lot of Lansdale stuff has that kind of weird, this is really out there kind of thing going on. And it's also set in Texas, so it also has that Western flavor to it. But most of his books are not set in the traditional 1865 to 1890 Old West period. But he's just a really terrific writer too. So yeah, anytime I get a chance to mention Joe Lansdale on screen, I'm gonna take it. So number 4 on my list is Charles Portis, who of course wrote True Grit, which is his masterpiece and is a true blue Western. But he wrote 4 or 5 other novels, one of which, Dog of the South, is absolutely hysterical. It's a comedy. But it's also a neo-Western. And it's basically about a guy's trip across the country following his wife who's run off with another man and all of his credit cards. And very, very entertaining. But Charles Portis is a really good writer. And, you know, all of his books have a little bit of an element of the Western to them, although I wouldn't call all of them Westerns. Number 5 on my list is Jack Schaefer. And Jack Schaefer makes it onto my list by virtue of one novel and one novel only, and that's Shane, which is as good a Western novel as you'll ever read, and it's incredibly short too. I want to say it's 130, 140 pages, something like that. It was not the only novel that he wrote. I haven't read his other novels, but I have enough faith in him as a writer after reading Shane that I suspect I'm really going to enjoy the other novels. If I'm wrong about that, I'll let you know. But he's definitely on my list of Western writers to pick up and read more of. Number 6, James Lee Burke. James Lee Burke is best known for a series of mystery novels about a Louisiana lawman named, okay, here comes the little chemo brain starting again. He's what's his name? Robichaux, Dave Robichaux. And he's written 25, 30, 35 novels in that series. But that's not the only series of novels that he's written. He's also written a series of novels, and it's much shorter, about a Texas Ranger who went on to become a defense attorney. And these would be considered your neo-Western type novels, and they're really good too. I think James Lee Burke is one of the finest English stylists in the business these days. He writes really, really good novels. And I've only read the first 2 of I think they're the Billy Bob Holland novels, but they're really, really good. And you should definitely check out his other stuff too, especially the Robichaux novels. Even though, you know, I think Louisiana might be too far east to consider it a Western, you know, it's definitely rural. You know, this is not some kind of urban novel that we're talking about here. I've got Louis Lamour on my list next of favorite Western writers. I like Louis Lamour. The books are short. They're to the point. He's a good storyteller. I like his characters. They're always interesting. The only complaint I have about Louis Lamour is that he tends to write in dialect, and it's really hard to pull off well. The only writer I know of that pulls off dialect really, really well, where I can stand it, is Mark Twain. But Louis Lamour makes my list in spite of that, which should say something about what a good writer he is. And he's written over 100 novels too. So, I mean, there's plenty to choose from. And a lot of them are parts of longer series, like The Sacketts is a really big novel that cover multiple generations of these families. So yeah, Louis Lamour. Number 8 on my list of my favorite Western authors is Elmore Leonard, who of course wrote, I think it was Hombre. I could be wrong about that, but he also wrote a lot of short stories that are collected in the complete short stories or the complete Western stories of Elmore Leonard, which includes a story that was made in a movie called 3:10 to Yuma, which is one of the best, it's two of the best Western movies ever made. The original with Glenn Ford is really, really good, but the remake is also a great Western. Number 9 on my list is Edward Abbey. He could not make my list because not only is he one of my favorite Western authors, but he's one of my favorite authors of all time. And he wrote maybe 8 or 9 books, and it's hard to consider any of them straight up Westerns. His first book was called Black Sun, and it's about a park ranger who falls in love with a young woman. But he's not just a park ranger, he's also a philosophy professor. And she winds up dead or lost or something like that, and he spends most of the book mourning her. His second novel, though, was more of a traditional Western called The Brave Cowboy, which came out, I think, in 1956, was made into a film with Kirk Douglas called Lonesome or the Brave. The character from that appears in 3 or 4 more of Edward Abbey's novels. Abbey's also famous for writing a novel called The Monkey Wrench Gang, which is about some eco-terrorists who fake, but not always fake, but conduct violence against the government who's trying to clean up the wilderness and cover it up with machines and that sort of thing. But they're opposed to this. They want the wilderness to stay wild. So those are a pretty interesting set of books. And number 10 on my list, which is no doubt going to be controversial, or as controversial as anything gets here on BookTube. I mean, how controversial is my video about my 10 favorite Western authors? Is Stephen King. Just because I'm so intrigued by The Gunslinger and the Dark Tower series. And The Gunslinger and the Dark Tower series, is definitely a neo-Western. It's also weird Western, science fiction, fantasy, covers multiple dimensions. But it bleeds over into almost his entire body of work at this point. So there are going to be people out there who say Stephen King's not really a Western author. And I'll be like, well, as the dude would say, that's just like your opinion, man. So those are my favorite Western authors. Who are your favorite Western authors? That's what I want to hear about. Who are your favorite Western authors and why? Who did I leave off that I should have included? Because my list is not carved into stone. I may change it if you've got some better ideas. I could probably make another list of 10 Western authors that I'd like to read, and it would be just as valid as this one anyway. Anyhow, I've got more videos coming soon about June on the Range and some of the other events that are going on this summer, and about some of the stuff that I'm reading just because I'm a quirky reader. Until then, stay hydrated, stay sexy, and I hope you're reading Westerns, but if you're not, I hope you're reading something you like even better than Westerns.